Hello and welcome to Health Professional Radio. I'm your host, Neil Howard. Thank you so much for joining us for another segment. We're going to be speaking with returning guest Dr. Jeff Stark in this segment. He's joining us here from UCB to talk about some new long-term complete skin clearance data for Bimekizumab in the treatment of moderate to severe plaque psoriasis in adults. Welcome back, Jeff. How have you been?
I've been doing well, Neil. Thanks. Hope you have as well, and it's great to be back with you and your listeners once again.
Glad that you're here. Been doing well myself. For those who may not be familiar with you as a contributor, describe briefly your role at UCB.
Sure. Thanks, Neil. So my name is Jeff Stark. I'm Head of Medical Immunology for the U.S. at UCB. In my role, I head up our medical affairs function in immunology, and in that role, oversee our home office medical affairs team as well as our field medical team, which most of your listeners will probably recognize as medical science liaisons or MSLs. I'm a rheumatologist myself by training.
Many of our listeners are familiar with plaque psoriasis, but for those who may not be familiar with plaque psoriasis, give us a brief look into this condition.
Sure. So it's always nice, Neil, to have the opportunity to shine a spotlight on psoriasis and what patients deal with who suffer with that condition. Psoriasis itself is a very common condition and can take many forms, plaque psoriasis being the most common of those. And psoriasis is a chronic inflammatory condition that most visibly affects the skin. It causes plaques or areas of the skin that are red, raised, and scaly. There are many symptoms that can accompany those plaques. Certainly just the visual nature of those is frequently very disturbing to patients who have to live with that day to day. But the plaques themselves can bleed, they can itch, they're frequently painful. There's a misconception, however, that psoriasis is only a skin disease when, in fact, it causes inflammation throughout the body and therefore can be accompanied by many other symptoms, including things like fatigue and depression.
Now, I did mention, of course, that you're going to talk about some new long-term data concerning Bimekizumab. I understand that the data was presented at this year's AAD annual meeting. Could you describe the findings for us and give us a bit of insight into the design of this latest study?
So, Neil, thanks for asking about this year's AAD meeting. It was certainly exciting in many respects. The meeting took place in Boston, and of course, after a break of having virtual meetings for a couple of years because of the pandemic, this was the first time to have a fully live AAD, and certainly it was a great occasion to have everyone back together once again and enjoying interaction and consuming some of the great data that was presented there. So for UCB and for Bimekizumab, it was an exciting occasion as well. Quite a volume of data that we had the opportunity to present at AAD this year, including 11 abstracts on new data for Bimekizumab. Perhaps one of the pieces of data that we were most excited to bring to the community was an oral late breaker session that focused on pooled 2-year data for Bimekizumab across the phase 3 and 3B clinical program. And the goal of that analysis was actually to look at durability of clinical response. And so patients who achieved complete skin clearance, that is a PASI 100 response at week 16 in the studies, were looked at over a 2-year period of follow-up. And what we were very excited to see in that analysis was that out of those patients who cleared their skin entirely, 8 out of 10 of them maintained completely clear skin through a 2-year period. So very, very exciting data that help us to understand the longer-term clinical profile of Bimekizumab. Bimekizumab, of course, is, as some of your listeners may know, an investigational product at UCB. A monoclonal antibody that specifically and potently targets not only IL-17A, but also IL-17F. And so one of the other exciting elements of data that we had the opportunity to present at AAD was from the BRADIANT study, where Bimekizumab was compared against secukinumab, a specific inhibitor of IL-17A alone. And a couple aspects of data from the BRADIANT study were presented there. One of those was looking at long-term responses in terms of complete clearance, as well as attaining an absolute PASI score below 2. And we were excited to see over a 96-week period of follow-up in that study that those responses were maintained for patients treated with bimekizumab. But we also had the opportunity to look at switch data from that study. So in that study, patients who were originally randomized to receive secukinumab and who were non-responders to secukinumab after 48 weeks, that is, they did not have a PASI 90 response, those patients were switched to bimekizumab for an additional period of follow-up. And we were excited to see in that switch analysis that those patients who did not achieve a PASI 90 response with secukinumab were more likely to achieve it when switched to bimekizumab. We also saw that a higher rate of achieving PASI 100 was seen in those patients who switched from secukinumab to bimekizumab in this open label extension of the study.
So when we're talking long-term effects, it seems to be 2.5 years is the target, or at least where we are in these particular studies?
So that's right, Neil, and these studies are ongoing. So this is one long-term element of the data, but we actually look forward to being able to describe even longer-term responses as these studies continue and we continue to collect data on these patients. And this is quite important because psoriasis is a chronic, lifelong condition. And so certainly we want to see our patients with plaque psoriasis improving quickly, but it's also important to understand how we can help those patients achieve improvement, not only for the short term, but also for the long term as well.
Talking about bimekizumab being indicated for plaque psoriasis, you mentioned that it can cause inflammation everywhere in the body. Is bimekizumab being researched for any other indications, either connected to psoriasis or not?
It's great to have the opportunity to talk about the bimekizumab program, and certainly at AAD for a dermatology audience, we were very focused on sharing the data for bimekizumab in plaque psoriasis. However, you're absolutely right. Psoriasis is a condition that can be associated with inflammation in areas other than the skin, and we certainly know it's part of a larger spectrum of diseases that are driven by IL-17A and IL-17F as causes of inflammation. And so very closely connected to plaque psoriasis is psoriatic arthritis. And certainly there is a robust phase 3 program underway to explore the efficacy and safety of bimekizumab in psoriatic arthritis. Additionally, rheumatologic conditions that can affect the spine and cause inflammation, they are conditions that we call axial spondyloarthritis, are also being studied in a phase 3 program. What I can share is that the pivotal results of those studies read out earlier this year, and UCB actually announced that those phase 3 programs in PSA, in ankylosing spondylitis, and in non-radiographic axial spondyloarthritis met their primary and all of their ranked secondary endpoints. So we're excited about sharing those data in future scientific congresses as well. But I will also mention that in the dermatology arena, another very impactful, frequently severe inflammatory skin disease called hidradenitis suppurativa is also being studied through a phase 3 program for bimekizumab. That condition, which is also known as HS, has limited therapeutic options today. And so we're very excited about the opportunity to explore the efficacy and safety of bimekizumab for HS in that program as well.
Give us a website where we can learn more, Jeff.
Absolutely, Neil. So if your listeners are interested in finding out more about these AAD data on bimekizumab that were presented, they can find that in our press releases located at www.ucb-usa.com.
Always a pleasure, Dr. Stark. Thank you so much for joining us once again here on Health Professional Radio.
Thanks for having me, Neil. It's always a pleasure to join you and your listeners.
You've been listening to Health Professional Radio. I'm your host, Neil Howard, in conversation with returning guest Dr. Jeff Stark, joining us here from UCB. Audio copies of this program are available at hpr.fm and healthprofessionalradio.com.au. You can also subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. Listen in, download at SoundCloud, and be sure and subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com, Health Professional Radio.